We hear an awful lot of discussion in the news about trade agreements. Now, most of it has to do with jobs and do they create jobs? Do they take job away? Do they ship jobs someplace else? Some of the discussion around the trade agreements is driven by concerns about climate change and other environmental variables. But I think there's a very limited understanding of what the linkages there are and why trade agreements are seen as a potential threat to climate change policy. So we thought it made sense to pull together some key information around this issue as a trending story in the climate web and allow you to then dig deeper into the story if you want to do that. So let me go ahead and jump over into the climate web just to run through this a bit with you. So what are the issues when it comes to trade agreements and climate? The real issue, as it turns out, are the dispute resolution provisions within these agreements. And as it turns out, there are thousands of agreements that have basically almost identical dispute resolution provisions. Now, you have to remember that the reason for these provisions has nothing to do with climate change or even really environmental issues. What this goes back to is the idea that you needed to have dispute resolution provisions for countries acting or basically abrogating on the idea of international trade and fair trade. So, for example, a country that might simply nationalize all sorts of private industry, including international industry. These dispute resolution provisions were in there so that the private sector could try and hold the government accountable for that kind of nationalization. This obviously at the time, which dates back quite a ways, it had nothing to do with thinking about climate change. It had to do with much more basic issues of governmentally inappropriate action. But what's happened in more recent years is that companies have started to figure out how to use these provisions to go after efforts by countries to implement environmental policy. And so companies have started to argue that when countries, it gets confusing, when countries put into place certain environmental strategies, what they're really trying to do is to exclude competition or to exclude certain international companies or to allow subsidization of local companies that damages the international companies. So suddenly this idea of environmental policy has been sort of sucked into this idea of international dispute resolution under these trade agreements, but you've got exactly the same dispute resolution provisions across thousands of these agreements. Now, when it comes to climate change, there's a very interesting example, and let me just jump into a couple of the stories that we've pulled together here. An example that will resonate here in the U.S. is the TransCanada pipeline deal, the Keystone pipeline. And ultimately, after years and years, ultimately that pipeline was disallowed by the administration after all kinds of analysis. What happened then is what's really interesting. You had TransCanada, which was the original proposer of the pipeline. They came out and said that they are going to sue the U.S. for $15 billion for denying the pipeline. So basically arguing that the U.S. denied the pipeline for inappropriate reasons, and so they're trying to recover all sorts of costs and profits, foregone profits, through these dispute resolution provisions of the North American Free Trade Agreement. And that's really what's going on here in terms of why environmental groups and increasingly countries have become concerned with these dispute resolution provisions. And it's basically a situation where companies have figured out how to use something that no one had really thought about years ago when they were including these provisions in all of the agreements. And where it goes now is really the big question. And I don't think it's totally clear where it's going to go. Now, if you want to dig deeper into this, you can click on the index entry for international trade agreements. You've got a couple of subcategories there for some of the specific agreements that we hear a lot about. But you also have the news section for investor-state dispute settlement, which has a reasonable amount of news coverage of the topic. And you also have the sources section for international or investor-state dispute settlement, which has some of the key literature in this space. So I hope that's been a useful, quick review of what's really going on with this climate change versus international trade discussion.